Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Rami Eid, and I am Exploration Geologist at Rashpetco. Rashpetco is a GV company with Shell, which operates in ultra-deep water in the Mediterranean. Today, we are presenting seismic methods in oil and gas exploration. This talk will be presented by Dr. Ali Bakr. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your Zoom control panel. I will bring them up during the presentation, and we will also have a time for questions at the end. Now we will turn the time over to Dr. Ali Bakr. Our presenter today is expert in oil and gas sector with more than 40 years of experience in exploration and development, geophysics and geology at all Egyptian provinces. He worked in Gulf of Suez, Western Desert, Nile Delta, Eastern Desert, and Sinai. And he worked also outside Egypt, like Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Oman, Chile, Norway, and Kuwait. Dr. Ali worked for different scale companies like Shell, Philips, Apache, Phoenix, Webco, Khalda, Qarun, and IBR. Also, he taught for 20 years at Alexandria, Cairo, and the Ain Shams, British University in Cairo, and American University in Cairo. Dr. Ali got his PhD in exploration seismology from Cairo Listric University at 1995. Thanks, Dr. Ali, for accepting our invitation. And now it is your time to start.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks, Rami. I'm very pleasant and happy actually to join you and give you an overview for the seismic interpretation. Actually, this is a part of 3 levels, of course, and this is just a level 1. I thought it would be better to start with level 1 and see how it will go. Once you are satisfied, I promise that I can continue with level 2 and level 3, inshallah, in the near future. To start directly, because we are very limited on time, I should give you an idea about the seismic itself, some of the limitation of the seismic, the meaning of the seismic, and then how we are acquiring our 2D data versus 3D data as a principle. Then we will jump to a little bit some introduction about what we are looking for, why you need, especially if you are a reservoir engineer or an engineer, why you need to learn more about seismic exploration, how does affect this on your career, how you can cooperate together with the G&G, the link between reservoir engineers and the geophysicists and geologists, very important, as integrated work together. And this is the lesson actually during the 40 years that I kept from time to time to repeat it for my colleagues. Let's go ahead and see what is the meaning of limitation of seismic, and then also how we are acquiring on our 2D data. In the front of you, this is a cross section. This is a map view on a seismic line, as you can see it, and the element or the G-phones that listen to the sound are recorded by this little dots in here. Actually, all of them are blunted, but only part of them are alive. So if I go to the cross section, if you have the line and the cross section like that, and in the middle of the line you have the firing point, the point is that we are producing energy from it, sound energy from it, and then the sound energy goes to the subsurface to a reflector. The reflector represents 2 beds, bed up from the reflector and the bed below the reflector, and those 2 beds does have a difference on the velocity and density, we call it acoustic impedance, and then accordingly the sound goes from the surface to the inter bed in between here, and then it reflects back and recorded with the G-phones. This means that in case of 2D, you have line laid out on the map view and the cross section on the subsurface. In case also, and the shot point usually lies on the same trend with the receivers. So the source and receivers are blunted or are put it on the same cross section. So this is the Z and this is the X or Y. So it's a 2D, it's a kind of 2D. That's why you call it a 2D. Actually, you are acquiring from different points on the subsurface to different point on the surface. And each point on the subsurface can cover more than once. What does it mean? It means that the sound goes to that point multiple times. And you call that a common depth point. Why we are doing that? Actually, we are doing that to enhance the data and increase the signal to noise ratio. On contrary, in case of the 3D, actually the G-phones are not blunted on line, but they are blunted on a kind of area. So it's an area rather than line. And the shooting, which is the red flag in this case, is more or less perpendicular to it. So this could be perpendicular to this group, and this also could be perpendicular to that group. So what does it mean? It means that one conclusion, in case of 2D, the source and receiver are on the same XZ direction, the same cross section. While in case of the 3D, the traces or the G-phones are blunted in aerial and the shooting is perpendicular to them. We have to understand this as this simple principles, because on the interpretation, we are going to use this very much. Yes? Now, a question, can the seismic see everything on the subsurface? Can we see 10 meters on the subsurface? Can we see 5 meters? Can we see 5 centimeters? The answer is no. Actually, the seismic is limited to resolve a special thickness of the bed, and is limited to resolve an extension of the bed. So if the bed, as example, is half kilometer or 10 by 10 meter, as example, less than that, 10 by 10 meter, you will never be able to see it at depths 3,000 meters. While you can see it at depths 1,000 meters. So there is we call that the horizontal resolution. So the horizontal resolution is, can we see two features beside each other? Can we resolve those two features? Can we see the extension of the bed? If the bed is not extended, you cannot see it. If the bed extended, you could see it. So this is what we call it seismic limitation. Also, the thickness of the bed. The thickness of the bed, if the bed is very thin, sometimes you cannot see it. There is some mathematical relations that will tell you how far you can see on the subsurface. In the front view, this is a seismic cross-section, 2D seismic, and I wanted to see if I can see some data at 1600. You know that everything on the subsurface for the geophysicist is in time. So 1600 millisecond means 1.6 seconds. Can I see a bed at that level, at that depth? How far? How can I see it? Actually, with very simple calculation, we can tell you that, as example, the bed here, you only can see the bed that thicker than 40 meter, as example, or 30 meter, as example. Once your bed is less than 30 meter, you will never be able to track it laterally within the seismic. And this is a kind of limitation. Also, if this bed extended or not extended, also it's another limitation. We call it a Fresnel zone. In the front view, this is the surface, and this is the ignition point, the point that we produce seismic waves from it. Once we did so, your seismic will travel, and then it will hit the subsurface in here. The area that the wave front hit the subsurface is called the Fresnel zone. So this is the minimum area extension of a bed that can be resolved. If your area of the bed is less than that area, you cannot see it. And this is what we call it Fresnel zone. So again, conclusion that our seismic is not a magic. It cannot see every thickness of bed. It cannot see every extension of the bed. It needs a minimum thickness of the bed to be seen, and it needs a minimum extension of the bed to be seen. Now we learned what? We learned the difference between 2D and 3D very roughly. One of them, which is a 2D, the shot and receiver are on the same plane, while on the 3D, The receivers are on an aerial plane while the shooting is perpendicular to them. And also we learn it together that the seismic is not a magic, and there is the difference in the vertical and horizontal resolution that limits our seeing to the seismic. Yes? Now, let's jump to some of the structure principles that you need to learn. Why we are shooting seismic? What is the principle that we need it in order to shoot seismic? As example, we are shooting seismic to image the subsurface. What kind of image you need? You need to see the faults. You need to see the folds. Both of them, you need to see them. Actually, the faults are simpler to be seen because they're extension and there is no complex on them. While in case of the faults, usually our hard job is the fault geometry itself. I'm going to ask you, how do you imagine the shape of the surface of the fault? Because unless you are familiar with the shape of the surface of the fault, you are not be able to see that fault on the subsurface and the seismic. So I'm going to jump to something very interesting to you. And in the front of you, usually the fault plane in the textbook, the fault is imaged like what? Like a page from a notebook, which completely is not right. It's not right to see it like that. Look at that definition. This is the fault plane. So this is an upstream side, this is downstream side, and this is your fault plane. Yeah, it's like a square or something like that, which actually in practically it's not so. The simple shape of the fault can be imaged after the 3D interpretation into a kind of ellipse, like in the front of you. So my faults will be on the 3D vision like a kind of ellipse. Why it's ellipse and it's not a kind of square? Actually, very simple, because on the surface, the fault got what we call it, if you walk on the field, on the mountain, and you look at the fault, you will see that the fault got what we call it taper off and taper on. It's ended from both sides. So unless it's like this shape, it will never be ended. So that's why we are saying that the fault itself is not a kind like a page from a notebook or like a square. It's a kind of ellipse. And this ellipse is not very smooth, but it has some irregularities. I used to tell my students that the best description for a fault plane is a slice of chipsy. Potatoes chipsy, a slice of potatoes chipsy. It's like ellipse, and it's not smooth, it's not straight, but has some irregularity in them. This is a typical description for the fault. Some of the items about the faults that you need to be aware, other than that, you will never be able to interpret this fault on the seismic. Number one is the fault plane. So now we already defined the fault plane. We call that the fault mapping parameter. You would like to map the fault, then you need to learn this parameter. And number two, the fault heave. As example, if I imaged this fault on the plane, on the map plane, then this is the upstream side of my fault, and this is the strike of my fault. So this is the bed tagged on blue, and it is when it hit by the fault, it has what we call it the fault strike, the fault strike. So this is the fault strike. You have a fault strike comes from the upstream side to the fault plane, and you have a fault strike come to the downstream side with the fault plane. Those can be imaged vertically on the map, and we call it by the fault polygon. So this is the faulty polygon that comes from the strike of the upstream side and the strike of the downstream side. If you imagine that there is many beds coming on the upstream side and many beds coming on the downstream side, each one of them got a strike with the fault. If we connected those strikes of the fault with the different beds, it will bring you the fault plane. Another thing, if I cut this with seismic line in this case, actually, which is this part in this case, if I just move this down, which will tell you this part, the edge of that ellipse, it's called the fault stick. Actually, the simple description for the fault stick, when you have a seismic section and you got your pencil and you start to trace the place of the fault by your pencil. What you are drawing here is the fault stick. You learn the fault plane, you learn the fault strike, and then you learn the fault stick, and the fault polygon. Now you got the fault heave and the fault thrown. The fault heave actually here the distance horizontally from case of normal fault between the strike of the upthrown side and the strike of the downthrown side, and it's represented the area where the bed is not presented or partially presented. It depends on the thrown of the fault. If this area is representing the area where is the bed is faulted out, completely faulted out, it's not there, or it's partially represented there. And actually the fault depth, which is the degree of depth of the fault, which is very important. Keep in mind this, the amount of this depth, because it's different in case of normal fault, reverse fault, strike slip fault. Each one of those faults simply got a range of depth. So if the depth, as example, reached 80 degrees or 85 degrees or 90 degrees, this means that it's a kind of strike slip fault. If the depth is 60 degree or 30 degree, this means that you got normal fault and reverse fault. Yes? So the depth angle itself is very important. The azimuth, which is the direction of the depth. So it's 30 degree in the north, 30 degree in the northeast, in the northwest. This is the azimuth. So you've got depth direction, you've got depth amount, you've got fault strike, fault stick, fault polygon, fault heave, fault plane, and the fault thrown. Or thrown mean the vertical separation. How much the upthrown side and downthrown side have been separated from each other. This is what we call it the fault thrown. All those together are, we call them the fault mapping parameter. For anyone who are working on the oil business, geologist, geophysicist, reservoir engineer, he has to understand this concept, simple concept, very simply. On the field in the front of you, as example, if you have one fault like the red one and then another fault like the blue one. Actually, when you see this on the map, you should look at the connection of the fault. If you connected those two faults in the extension basin, you should have the summation of those two faults should be equal to that fault to completely in order to be connected. I'll tell you what also. There is a relation between the length of the fault in the field and the amount of the thrown. So you'll never be able to put as example, fault only extended for 1 kilometer while its thrown is 3 kilometers. It will never happen in the nature. It's very important to realize exactly what you are seeing of data before going to the next step of the interpretation. And there is a rule of thumb here. The length to the maximum thrown, L over T, varies from 20 to 150. So the length of the fault should be 20 times, at least 20 times value more than the, if the thrown is 1, the length of the fault should be 20. Or maybe more. So it should be 20 or more. Actually, 60 is a good approximation. So it's between actually 20 and 150 is almost 60. So the length over the thrown should be about 60 approximation. You have to look for your seismic interpretation to see this approximation, very important. And also in case of strike slip fault, or even the thin sedimentary rocks, thin depositional fault, sometimes the L over T ratio increase more than that. Well, I'm going to jump directly to the kind of fault. So this such a kind of fault where you have a parallel, more or less parallel fault. We call them a kind of domino shape for the fault blocks. And actually, usually you see this as a kind of books on the library. When you book for the library shelf, it's kind of blocks, and all of them are more or less flexured on the same direction. And they got two scales. They got small scales and large scale. So an example here, very big scale for those faults and very small scales in that case. So the first type of faults is planars, a kind of planars. We call them planars. We will see this on the seismic. Then this is on the seismic. On the seismic, you got as example in the front, very nice planars in there. This styles is very important for the interpreter. When you look at the seismic, we directly know what kind of trap when we look at the type of the style. We look at the style in order to predict the type of trap. So in this case, those planar will bring you a different compartment. Each compartment, like example, each compartment will have its own oil-water contact, will have its own sealing in this case. Let us go next. This is the interpretation of this kind of planar fault styles. And then we will jump to, this is on the cross-section view on the seismic. The shape on the map will be like this. 3-way deep closure from planar fault. So in the cross-section, it was normal fault. It was normal fault on the previous example. Let me go back to it. So it was normal fault, more or less, planar. And then actually, when we go on the map view, you will see the closures are more or less 3-way deep closures. And each of these 3-way deep closure will have its own oil-water contact, and it will have its own sealing. And usually such kind of planar entrapment on the seismic usually doesn't have one big field, but have different small fields beside each other. Each one of these nice trap could have, say, 10, 15, 20 well from them. Actually, many fields in the Western Desert of Egypt are like this. In Libya, it's just like this. In Sudan, it's just like this. All the North Africa have this kind of the planar shape of fault. Jump to the next one, which is the Listric fault. The Listric fault, the shape of the fault on the cross-section usually like crescent, and actually on the map view, it's like crescent as well. So you see, as example, in the front of you here, on the field, you'll see that the fault have some sort of curve on the shape on the cross-section, and thicknesses on the downstream size are thicker than the upstream size. And also the scale, this is a big scale, while it could be very small scale like in here. You look at that bin. So even for the style of the Listric fault, you do have big scale and small scale. And the most important things in here is the shape of the fault itself. On the cross-section, it will be crescent shape. And on the map view, like what we're going to see, it's going to be
الكروس سكشن زي ما احنا شايفين في الكروس سكشن ده شكله كريسنت اهو. طبعا على الماب فيو في الناحيه الثانيه هتلاقي برضه شكله كريسنت. طيب على الداون ثرون سايد منه هتلاقي رول اوفر انتيكلاين. انتيكلاين جميله جدا وليها 4 دب لكن ليها اكس. الاكس بتاع الانتيكلاين دي عاده باراليل للفولت بلين نفسه، يعني مش هتلاقي الاكس ده مايل الناحيه دي او مايل الناحيه دي، لا الاكس ده باراليل للفولت بلين اللي انتجها. والانتيكلاين زي ما قلنا هتبقى اليبتيكال انتيكلاين. ليها اكس طويل وليها اكس اقل وباراليل للكريسنت فولت اللي هو الكروس فولت بتاعنا. ودي مثال ليها من السايزميك. ادي الانتيكلاين الجميله جدا دي كرول اوفر انتيكلاين. الرول اوفر انتيكلاين بتمثل
Guys, let me back to this. I'm not sure if you, because actually I just found by mistake a drawback of the Arabic sound over there. Let me show you on the cross section you have the shape of the crescent of the fault itself, and on the downstream side you have the rollover anticline representing the best trap in case of the Listric fault. On the seismic you can see the anticline and also the rollover anticline usually have an axe. This axe is parallel to the fault that produced. To the left, there is also a shape of the crescent fault from the seismic, and then you have the rollover anticline. Those are the two shape of structure style that you can see it on the seismic. Another shape from the seismic, see the shape of the fault itself. It looks like crescent in here, and also you have some sort of rollover anticline. This is also representing the type of the structure style of the rollover anticline that associated with the Listric fault. Here the interpretation, you can see the fault and you can see the anticline on the downthrown side. By revealing that, we'll jump directly. So let me resume first what we talked about. We talked about the planar fault and how the traps of the planar faults could look like on the seismic. And then we talked about Listric and how the shape of the Listric on the cross section like crescent and on the map view like crescent, and how it produces a rollover anticline on the downthrown side where you can have an axe parallel fault itself, and it represents a very nice target trap for the exploration. Now we will jump into the reverse fault. In the front view, there is a seismic section. There is a seismic section on the front view, as you can see, and it had been affected by reverse fault, and the reverse fault's position in here. And actually, we have to take in consideration the dip angle of the reverse fault itself. See, this is the dip angle of the reverse fault, and those are blank colored in yellow are the correlatable units. So this unit is that unit just for eye to follow. And you can see the place of the fault in between. And this, of course, comes by the compression rather than extension. The first two styles that we talked about comes from extension regime, and now we are talking about compression regime. The area is affected by compression regime, and it produced this nice anticline. And this is our colored model for the previous interpretation, where you have, if you drilled a well here, you will see this. You will see this bed repeated more than once, and this bed could be repeated more than once, and this bed could be repeated more than once. This gives you a sense of the reverse. The reverse happen, and then some erosion will happen. Another example from the Gulf of Mexico showing the very nice a kind of reverse fault, with very nice interference and different kind of faults as well. Jumping from the tension regime by planars and by gross faults or Listric faults to the reverse faults. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the strike-slip fault. Strike-slip fault, the angle of the fault itself, or the dip of the fault, usually between 75 or 80 up to 90. So it could be vertically, more or less. And usually it's basement involved. The basement itself involved on the movement itself. And a very important example with this, the Dead Sea example between Sinai and the Arabian Plateau itself around Lebanon, Syria, and going to even to Aqaba in Egypt. It could be in the direction of the watch or right lateral or left lateral. So those are the two components. One of them moved relative to the other one in that direction. We call it dexter or right lateral, or even it's left lateral. The end result of that is a nice change on the shape of the traps itself. On the map view, you can see this very easily on the right lateral and left lateral, and actually on the cross section you can see it either producing what we call a positive flower structure or a negative flower structure on the section, where one of the units moved toward you like T, and the other one moved away from you in the other direction, and it produced very complicated kind of structural trap. Now the question, why we are getting all of this complication? Actually, structural geology, how you will never be able to interpret seismic data without having this structural geology on your mind while you interpreting your data. The last style, but the most important one, is the inverted basin structure. Some of the area geologically all over the world subjected to tension in their geological history, and then after that compression or transpression on a later period. The change from tension regime into transpressional regime or compression regime changed the shape of the totally the shape of the subsurface. What was used to be in low relief started to be high, and vice versa. The high relatively become low. Actually, we can from seismic recognize this directly. And I'm going to show you some interesting criteria that I collected myself and put them on 7th point. As you can see here, 7th point, that if you look at those, if you recorded those 7th point from the seismic, this will tell you that your area subjected to tension and then compression or transpression, and you have to make sure that you understand this in order to pick up your right track. From the seismic, very interesting stuff on the seismic. This is across all of these features are cross features from real seismic data. I'll start with the first one. If you have a fault at the cross section that's showing normal thrown at depths and reverse thrown up, as example in here. Look at that fault. Look at that fault. This fault is showing the red one. This fault is showing, let me change my pointer so you can see it like laser. Look at the red fault in here. You can see that the thrown of that fault is normal and the thrown up is reverse. Very interesting. This fault is completely normal. This fault is completely normal. This fault is showing normal down and reverse up. When you see something like that, count that as one of the 7 criteria that will tell you this area subjected to an inversion. Look for different other stuff. Look at that fault. This fault to the left, you have null. You have no any other displacement. While when you go up, you will see the displacement on the other reflector is reversed, and here it's showing a kind of asymmetric anticline. The shape also are a criteria for inversion, where you have a null point of displacement and reverse point, and then you got asymmetric anticline in the up. Look at the third example. This example from Tunisia, actually. You see that the fault is showing reverse and very nice anticline, asymmetric anticline in the top of it. When you look at this example from Egypt, again, the fault is showing reverse thrown and showing here a very nice asymmetric anticline in there. On the map view, this nice anticline could be something like that, a very nice trending northeast southwest anticline from the same area. And actually the fault is heading after this nice asymmetric anticline. And usually there is dip, fast dip in that direction and gentle dip in the other direction. So it is a kind of asymmetric anticline. So I counted now at least 5 or 6 criteria that you can pick it up from the seismic, and you can tell yourself that this area is subjected to extension and then compression or transpression, and what expectation you have for the trap. Directly when you see this kind of inversion, your expectation will go directly to this nice targeted traps, asymmetric one, in here, in there, in there, in here, in there, everywhere. So, as example, here, let us check our understanding for the inversion, for the structure inversion from the seismic data. So you will see nice asymmetric anticline, short steep limb, and then gentle back other limb. One criteria. The other, reverse fault in here and anticline in there. 2. Number 3, fault that thrown normal here and reverse here. Let me put the interpretation. And then fault throwing normal here and reverse up. Fault throwing reverse here. And actually, if you look for all the other fault, which are kind of planners, yes, there is no any indication about inversion. So this is what we call it differential inversion. So not all of the faults subjected to the same compression regime or tension affected directly. It could be affected, but we cannot pick it from the seismic. Something interested in here, look at this feature. Here is up, down, up, which means that this is grappling. And then when you go here, down, up, down, horizontal. So horizontal above grappling will tell you that this area is subjected to inversion. Something very interesting also, and last point for the inversion prediction. When you see the thickness of the blue for the recent deposit after this green color, the recent deposit are thickening on that direction. Now, while we are talking and discussing, the deposition is happening in that area. Last in the past, the deposition thickening was here on the green. So the depositional center, it changed from here on the past during the green into now the blue. So the change of the depositional center will tell you that this area subjected to extension and then into compression. Now I'm going to jump a little bit about the faults and start with this introduction, start a little bit to teach you something how we are doing our real job on the interpretation. Now, the guys who are not aware with the acquisition have some idea about the acquisition, the 2D versus the 3D. The guys who doesn't have an idea about the structure style, aware with the structure style about the extension regime or the compression regime or the transpiration or transtension regimes, and aware with the structures that will happen. If it is planar, if it is a gross fault or Listric fault, or if it is a strike slip fault, or even if it is inverted. And from the seismic, anyone out the geologist and geophysicist can infer for the reservoir engineer the structure style and its complication, and accordingly the uncertainties that will come from the data that have been interpreted. The reservoir engineer need to understand that the geologist and the geophysicist got some limitation and uncertainties. The limitations come from the seismic, the limitations comes from the tool. And then the uncertainties come from the tools and also come from the interpretation itself. So if you put a fault, sometimes you are not sure that this is the right position of the faults. It can be changed from error. And the reservoir engineer should understand this. Now, let us see how we can start our interpretation. While we got this background, that we got it in the last 35 minutes or more. The first thing to do is to tie your well data on the depth domain with your seismic data on the time domain. Because you have two domains, all the seismic is in time, while all the well data, the drilling of the well data is on depth. We tie that with what we call it seismic to well tie. The seismic to well tie, I need to define my well tops that I got it from my well that I drilled, the depths per each top, including my reservoir into my seismic. While my seismic is on time and the well is in depth. I used to tie this, I use what we call it seismic to well tie. Can be done by many different tools. The main tool to tie them is what we call it synthetic seismograms, where we use the velocity and density and velocity log, the sonic log, the density log, and the check shot or velocity log together to come up with a 1D, a trace like the seismic trace, representing the well. And this trace, the synthetic seismogram, got two scales. One of those scales is time scale that fit the seismic, and the other is depth scale that fit the well logs. So I can switch between the time scale and the depth scale on that synthetic seismogram. The way of creating synthetic seismogram is not our issue here. I don't want to go to the details of drawing it, but just understand the idea that I can transfer the well tops from my well logs into my seismic, from the depth domain into my seismic on the time domain using the synthetic seismogram, or sometimes we do what we call it vertical seismic profile, where we are recording inside the wells the velocity of the waves per each bed, the velocity of the wave per each bed that I have been drilling. Yes, and from that also I can give a time depth table that can transfer the data from time to depth by using the informations from velocity. If I did so, I will be able to mark my beds, my tops, my reservoir, my source rock, my cap rock directly on the seismic. I can put them word on the side. And in the front of you in here, this is my my seismic. I can get this my data directly to my seismic on that location using the synthetic seismogram and start to mark my horizon. The creation of the synthetic seismogram is very simple, using the, as I mentioned, the density log, the velocity log, and then multiply the velocity by density, come up with a acoustic impedance, and then calculate the reflectivity using the RC equal to rho 2 V2 minus rho 1 V1 divided by rho 2 V2 plus rho 1 V1, the reflection coefficient equation, very simple, and then come up with one trace, and this trace got two scales. One scale is on time, other scale is on depth, and I can use this synthetic seismogram to tie the well data with the seismic data. Yes? Now, if I tied my seismic data, I already tied my seismic data, and I'm quite happy with what I got. What's next? Do I go directly and map my horizons and map my faults? The answer is no. Now the technology learned us to use what we call it automated structural interpretation. Actually, it's not automatic. It's an automated. The word automated means that I'm going to use my software to help me in order to infer my structure element. Not to interpret the data, but to help me to interpret the data. That's why we call it automated. None of the people now all over the world is using the manual, the normal manual line by line. But we are using the volume attribute, the structural volume attribute, where we can calculate some of the attributes for the volume directly without doing any kind of interpretation. We can calculate some of those attributes that would help me to define the strike of my main faults and my minor faults. Even now, with the quality of the data, I would be able to define not only the faults, but also the fracture. The fracture in the carbonate rock, as example, is responsible for the porosity. So I can use this volume attribute just by click. You put the seismic volume from one side, and you get from the other side the volume as an attribute. I'm going to show you this in a minute. In the front of you, very interesting two features. Yes? This is a time slice. I'm not sure if you are aware with the 3D displays. The 3D displays, the 3D seismic come from like a cube of data. And this cube of data, you can slice this data in any direction you like. You can slice it vertically, and we call it inline, like seismic section in here. Or another line perpendicular to that one, we call it inline. So there is inline, cross line perpendicular to each other, and they are seismic, 2D seismic section, like 2D seismic section. We call it inline and cross line. And also we can have a time slice where I have more or less iso time through the volume itself. So in the front of you, this is a map view for a horizon picked using 3D seismic. And to the left, this is an inline or cross line. It's almost the same. If you would like to see the shape of this inline or cross line on the map, you can see it. So in that direction, this is inline. In the other direction, this is cross line or whatever. You can switch vice versa, call that inline and cross line or cross line and inline. And then the time slice. Actually, the data displays on the time slice in here, it's not the direct seismic data, but a kind of attribute. I use this data and use my computer, and I asked my software to calculate the seismic attribute here called variance, or actually coherency. And this attribute is a kind of calculation. It does have a mathematical meaning, which a correlation between each single trace, and it will give me another volume of seismic called variance cube. At that variance cube, I can cut time slice, like this time slice, or depth slice, if the data is the depth domain. And actually, from this slice at the level of interest, I can slice at any level, from 0 level up to the end of the data. And at this time slice, I can look for the strike of my fault. Look at this nice strikes of the fault, very resolvable. When I go do my mapping, I have to follow this, fault. So this a trend of fault have been done by the variance. I didn't do any interpretation. I just got my data and calculated the variance. And from the variance, I looked at my faults, at the strike of my faults at that level. And actually, there is another direction. You can see the north is the big fault. This is a big fault, another big fault, a third big fault, and they cut it by another northwest, southeast fault. All of that resolved directly. When I do my mapping, I should follow this strikes of that fault. This means that I'm doing my interpretation on a real 3D vision. I will never divide my interpretation into inlines and the cross line and connect them blindly on the map. No, I put my variance attribute or any other attribute with my inline, with my cross line, and then I start fault by fault on the real 3D vision, on the real 3D vision. Look at that. I'm going to show you this example, how we do that. This is seismic section. This is variance or coherency volume. And actually, I go back and forth with that inline in that direction or that direction. And at each one of those inline or cross line, I put the position of my fault and move and the position. So the net result will put my strikes. So this is my strikes for the fault, and this is my stick. Sorry, this is my stick for the fault, and this is my strike for the fault. So my sticks that comes from the inline or cross line, or my strike that comes from the variance or coherency, together are connected, and they are forming what? They are forming my fault plane. They are forming my fault. Very, very, very informative together and very accurate as well. So I never did do my interpretation on the basis of inline, cross line, and the map view. This is wrong. We have to use the 3-direction vision while doing interpretation to exactly check the fault plane. Then actually, when things got crowded, so you have the blue fault, you have the green fault, you have the yellow fault, different fault, each one will have identification. Then after that, we are going to change these fault by fault into plane, fault plane. Now I have fault plane. Before I have fault sticks, connected them together and come up with fault plane. Now I have my fault plane resolved on a 3D vision. Yes, and you can see the fault top and the fault grid itself, very smooth and very important. And you can see that the shape of the fault is not like a page from the notebook, or it's not like a square or any other geometrical shape. It looks like an ellipse and maybe irregular ellipse as well. Once I finished my, my interpretation and I changed my fault into the fault plane, I will start to do my horizon interpretation, horizon by horizon, and then I can come up with a map like in the front of you. And as you can see, this map have been interpreted each line. So not each 5 lines or in each cross line, no, each in line and each cross line together, line by line. But actually we are not putting by line, but we are putting segment by segment. I finish this segment and use my automated interpretation tools in order to fill in and check back until I finish all block by block, and then all my horizon would be interpreted. So my horizon have been interpreted in the 3D vision, and then my faults also interpreted 3D vision, and I have both of them. I have the horizons and I have my fault planes together. I can go directly and put them on a structural model. Now, my horizon are okay and have been checked, and their termination against my fault plane have been checked. Both of them, I can start to build my structural model. But there is a question. Your data on the time domain, and if you do a structural model on the time domain, you would never be able to follow up next step to calculate reserve. So you need to change all of your data. If it's not from the beginning on the depth domain, you need to change it to the depth domain. How can I do that? Oh, I can do that with what we call it a velocity model. I mean, I have to have my data, change it from the time domain to the depth domain. I'm going to fly over the velocity. I'm not going to say any details, but actually, rule of thumb. All the velocities, actually the velocity is the most complicated topic in the seismic. The explorationist or the geophysicist who understand the velocity is one of the best geophysicists. I consider him the hero of the interpretation, because actually it had a lot, the velocity had a lot of uncertainties into our data. When we go to the reservoir engineer, it adds a lot of uncertainties. That is, we have to be aware in order to calculate the right volume comes from the G&G. So rule of thumb, the velocity could be measured or calculated or estimated. It have been listed like that according to the accuracy. So the measured is the most accurate one. When you put your tool inside the well and then you measure the velocity inside the well, this is the most accurate one, representing the well. or you can get it from core, but you have to take in consideration the pressure, the temperature, the condition of the core in order to measure the velocity. Then they calculate it if you use as example this equation or any other equation in order to calculate velocity. Then you can do some sort of estimation. So the last one is the least for the accuracy. Less accuracy, and then accuracy change as you go to up. Then any names like instantaneous, average, interval, root mean square, apparent, any one of those could be measured and could be calculated and could be estimated. If I have, because usually you do have many sources while you are doing your time to depth conversion. So look at the sources of velocity that started with measured. If you do have measured, start with measured. If you have calculated, do calculate. If you have estimated, if you have the three, you will do a model using the three and see the different scenarios for the uncertainties. To understand the complexities, the velocity affect what? Porosity, affect density, temperature, great size, poor pressure, overburden, frequency, many, the presence of gas and oil. I'll tell you what, some of the small gas could give you the same indication like a very big field saturation of gas because of the velocity. So we need to understand the velocity as well. I'm not going to also take more about the velocities, but I'll give you some just flyover that the model of the velocity could be a single layer. I can do layer by layer, bed by bed, or I can do all the layer together in what we call it multi-layer or layer cake, or actually the yellow one, which is the most accurate recent one, where we do a 3D grid velocity model. In that velocity model, we do that. We have the seismic horizon on the time domain that covers the area. We have the stacking velocity that comes up from processing center or migration velocity. And we have the well top as a calibrations. And then we have the check shot velocities. We use those four managers together to build a 3D velocity model grid. And this grid will produce for me a 3D velocity model that I can get my faults and my fault planes and my horizon together into that model and got my model into the depth domain from the other thing. And usually this is a step on most of the world right now using such kind of time to depth conversion, unless you have a pre-stack depth migration data in the depth domain, then you will work directly on the depth domain. You don't need to do these steps. Now we changed our data from time to depth, and our data is ready. If you would like to finish your structural model, you can do it. You can do now your structural model. A question will be raised. The seismic exploration is only structure? And the answer, big no. We have stratigraphic interpretation, but never and ever start a stratigraphic interpretation without understanding the regional geology of the area and without understanding the structure model of your data. So you do your interpretation for the structure model and then finish the structure model and then go to the seismic interpretation, seismic stratigraphic interpretation. And also then you have what we call it seismic sequence stratigraphy. And then we have direct hydrocarbon indications and AVO or DHI. This will cover the rest part of the lecture, which is seismic stratigraphic attribute and the seismic and stratigraphic interpretation, and using the direct hydrocarbon indicators and amplitude versus offsets. This is represent a very important part for the exploration seismology. Actually, usually big part of that area is now is called QI, quantitative interpretation. So actually this part is a quantitative interpretation. Dive more into quantitative interpretation. What does it mean of quantitative interpretation? It means that I can give the G&G or the geophysicist can give his colleague from the geologist and from the reservoir engineer idea about the porosity of the reservoir all over the area from the seismic, about the water saturation, about the sand shale ratio, about all other quantitative stuff that they need in order to calculate their volumetric, the volume in place of gas or of oil. So this part could be named as quantitative interpretation, while the qualitative interpretation usually relative to the structure interpretation and a very small part from the AVO only. Let me jump very fast on the stratigraphic interpretation. I'm going to just list one thing, one of the attributes. We've got an attribute for the structure interpretation, and we've got only one example, which is the variance or coherence, and we have learned how we used this variance or coherency in order to detect the strike of our fault. In this case, I'm using the stratigraphic attribute for the stratigraphic interpretation in order to pick up the geometry of a channel. So as example, this is what we call it spectral decomposition. Very fast, what does it mean, spectral decomposition? It means that I decompose the signal around my target in here into single frequencies. Say I have many frequencies into my target in here, which is from 5 hertz up to 60, 70, 80 hertz. So I decompose this interval into volumes of different single frequencies. Actually, the decomposing itself will reveal the shape of the stratigraphic feature according to a principal rule that the change from sand, Nigel Anstey started this principle almost 30 years ago, and he mentioned that the change from sand to shale or from shale to sand is very sensitive to the frequency content or vice versa. Yes, so accordingly, we started to see when we resolve and decompose our seismic band into different single volumes, and then we convolve them again, or actually we blend them, and we give each single frequency a color. So as example, the 40 hertz, we give it blue, the 50 hertz, we give it green, the 60 hertz, we give it red, and then we blend them together and do time slice at that level. And as you can see, the blending, it gives us the shape of the different channel system that goes there. This is published by British Petroleum about 20 years ago, about 18 years ago. And actually, you can extract this geobody by many different software now, and you can calculate your volumetric from it. So this is a kind of stratigraphic interpretation, just to give you a flavor about the stratigraphic interpretation. Now, there is another thing concerning the direct hydrocarbon indicator, which is the AVO, or amplitude versus offset. Actually, when we acquire our data, we are using seismic, and the seismic have some near the source receiver and away from the source receiver. The receiver that near of the source should receive the most energy, so the reflection should be the reflection from the subsurface, and the nearest offset should have the biggest or the strongest reflection. While from the same point, the last receiver, the far away should receive the least reflection. In case of the presence of hydrocarbons, especially gas, this simple phenomena is not there, because the presence of the gas inside the sand change the elastic properties of the rock itself, and it will shape differently. As example, if you are here and you are throwing a piece of stone on the top of the water, if you throw it this more or less with angle, this stone will jump and hit the water and jump and hit the water. While if you actually, if you actually got this stone and you throw it up, you didn't throw it parallel to the water or with angle, you throw it up, it will go and then it will sink directly into the water. Why did the water behave different when you throw the stone with an angle, while when you throw the stone, since it goes vertical? When it goes vertical, it sinks directly. When it goes with angle, it's actually hit the surface and it's have some sort of resistivity. Because actually, the liquid behaves different. The rock behave exactly. The rock behave exactly like in case of the angle, while the liquid behave differently. When you put the liquid inside which is the fluid inside the rock, it changes the rock properties of the of the rock itself, and the result of what? That the far offset will give you higher amplitude. So amplitude versus offset, as the amplitude increase, the far offset, the amplitude increase. As you can see in here. So this is the near offset, and this is the far offset, and this interval is saturated with gas. So it's a sand saturated with gas. As you can see, as you go from the near offset to the far offset, the amplitude increase give you an indication on the presence of gas. Actually, this is a simple rule of thumb, and this rule has a lot of deviation from it. Another thing I would like to give your attention to, the direct hydrocarbon indicators. From the seismic, we can predict that there is an oil directly without drilling. As example, this is an anticline, and this is a nice event. So this is an anticline, while this a nice horizontal event comes from the oil-water contact or the hydrocarbon liquid contact. So if you have gas here and oil there, or if you have oil there and water here, and this is a contact, and this contact is imaged from the seismic, so we can predict it directly. Also, what we call it bright spots and dim spots. There is on the seismic some areas where something like that is very bright. Actually, it's almost flat, but also it's bright. So this brightness tell you that this area have something different than that area or that area, and this is what we call it bright spot, in case bright spot. So you have an area that have different behavior between the up and down. So here are high velocity, here low. Here high velocity, here low, well, here is very low. When you have something like that, this will give you a bright spot, or vice versa. And also, if you have low velocity with high, low velocity with high, low with high, this will give you a dim spot. So the presence of bright spots, dim spots, or flat spots is a kind of DHI, or direct hydrocarbons indicator. Last thing on our talk is the seismic inversion. Actually, or what we are doing here is our interpretation on the seismic. We are interpreting the interface between layers. Because actually seismic looks for the reflection that comes from the interface between two different layers. Those two different layers have different acoustic impedance or have different density and velocity. So layer 1 got density 1, velocity 1. Layer 2 got density 2, velocity 2. As much as the difference in velocity density or acoustic impedance, you will see reflection. So your reflection comes from the interface. It didn't come from the bed. It comes from the interface between two beds. By the end of the day, you are mapping the surface as representing a top of the, but while it comes from the interface. It didn't give any geological information about the bed itself, about what's happening on the bed itself. In order to get geology, you need to change your domain from the domain of the reflection into the domain of the acoustic impedance itself. So when we change the data from the domain of the seismic into the domain of the acoustic impedance, this means we are doing an inversion. We are switching data from seismic data directly into geological data. As example, in the front of you, the Earth comes from different geologic units. Then, if I got the geologic unit and I shot seismic, I convert with them with wavelet, like I give them seismic, and I responded back a seismic section. So this seismic section is represented one. Does this part representing the geology here? No, it does represent the difference in that one, is representing the difference in the acoustic impedance, in the interface. While in case of inversion, I have my seismic and I'd like to change it to geology. I'd like to make it like geology in here. So this means I do what? I have to make an acoustic, to do an acoustic, change that seismic into acoustic impedance, and this called seismic inversion. And actually, if somebody asked me, do we need to do an inversion, seismic inversion for every project that I'm doing with? The answer is, if you are doing regional interpretation, maybe you don't. But if you are doing a prospect, then you must. If you are doing a development field, then you must. So in case of development feed, you must do seismic inversion. In case of the prospect feed, you must do also an inversion, because actually you need to, in case of the prospect, you need to calculate precisely your volumetric according to your economics. Okay? In case of development, you already have a development plan and you don't need to drill a dry hole within the development reach, so you need to understand exactly the distribution of porosity, your permeability, your water saturation, your every quantitative single parameter. And this is called seismic inversion. Now, the seismic inversion, changing your data from the reflection of the seismic into acoustic impedance and the geology meaning, could be done with stack data, and we call it post-stack inversion, or you can do it pre-stack inversion. The main difference, in case of the pre-stack, you will be able to calculate some quantitative parameters, like water saturation, porosity, or whatever. While in case of post-stack, you will never be able to calculate any quantitative figures, but you will use more or less a qualitative interpretation. So in case of inversion, this is a volume of seismic. I can change it directly. There is many algorithms to change the seismic data into acoustic impedance or inversion post-stack, and you can get some understanding about porosity, fluid contact, some of the content lithology, but qualitatively, not quantitatively, because it's a post-stack. Then if it is pre-stack, the different things are different, because actually you can get what? You can get porosity, lithology, output, you can get acoustic impedance or porosity and density, and you can prediction for fluid type, it's gas, it's oil, water. You can do whatever we call it as a fluid substitution. You can do many things using seismic inversion. Well, this is just a flyover for all what the seismic data can give you. The last message that I want to give it to my colleague here, for the geologists and geophysicists, this is more or less understandable. For my reservoir engineers colleagues, I would like to give their attention to the geophysicist got limitation on the tool that he's using, which is the resolution. He cannot see every bit. He cannot see every single thin bit. Also got complexities from the subsurface, from the structure. So he's got uncertainties because of the velocity that he's using, the change from time to depth. He got some complexities from the structure that he's doing interpretation, structure interpretation. He got some complexities on doing stratigraphic interpretation, of course, yes. The end result is that he got a very big list of uncertainties. And these uncertainties will directly go to the your model as a reservoir engineer, final model of a reservoir engineer as a static model, as example, or even as a dynamic model. So the cooperation between the geologists, the geophysicists, and the reservoir engineers, and the production engineer as well, should be very close, because actually it's not delivering output. You don't deliver the G&G work to the reservoir engineer and leave it to him, no, or to the geomodeler, or the guy to do it. You have to work as a team, because by the end of the day, you will calculate a volume, and this volume will be used for drilling, will be capitalized, and will be used for the future of the company, and this will affect directly on the future of the company. So do this work with understanding the uncertainties within this work, and also understand why you need to understand, example, the fault. If you have two compartments and you have between those two different compartments, you have a change on the pressure, and you don't have a fault between them. So you go back directly to your colleague and he recheck the uncertainties present, and maybe he can pick for you that fault that is unresolvable and add it to the model. So again and again and again, work as a group, work as a team, and each one integrate the other together, and don't ever accept, you as a reservoir engineer, don't accept just a deliver from your geophysicist and geologist and then continue work directly blindly. No, work as a very close team. And I think I'm done. Thank you. and looking forward now for any question.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ali, for your interesting presentation. And actually, we have learned a lot of during this presentation. We will move to some questions. The question number one from James, it says, what is the difference between Listric and gross fault?
That is a good question. I used to tell the guys, not every gross fault is a Listric, while each Listric is a gross. So when I say gross, it's a very regional word. I mean, the gross could start at one bed, at one age, and then finished. The gross could start within the age of the fault, or the last part of the fault. So in this case, it's a gross fault by any means, because it's growth on an interval, just one interval, time interval. So the grossing of the bed happened into one time interval. And that's why it's very important. When you say gross fault, you have to complete the statement. You say gross fault on the Turonian, or gross fault on the Maastrichtian. This describes that the grossing happened only during the Maastricht. Or you can say gross fault all over the fault. While in case of Listric, the Listric usually it's a gross on most of the age of the fault. And also the Listric got this interesting feature. It's a crescent shape on the cross section and the crescent shape on the map view. So in this case, you can say it's a gross fault. Yes, it's a Listric, but it's a gross fault. But you never to call the gross fault as a Listric only. So not every gross fault is Listric, but each Listric is a gross.
Okay, thanks, Doctor, for your answer. The question number two says, asymmetrical anticline always indicate inversion?
That's very nice. Actually, when I say indication, I say criteria, not an indication. You have at least 7 to 9 criteria to pick from them the presence of inversion. One of them is asymmetric, but the asymmetric could happen on different other styles. As example, you have fault that throwing normal down and then reverse up, and then asymmetric anticline, and then the presence of grappling over horse or horse over grappling, and then the change of the depositional center, and then the null point. All of those are criteria. You cannot only say from the asymmetric anticline only the single criteria as the inversion. No, because actually there is other structure feature that shows asymmetric anticline as well. So it's one from the criteria of identification of inversion, not the main criteria. Okay?
Okay, Doctor. Thanks, Doctor. The question number 3, what is the difference between positive and negative inversion?
That's fine. Actually, the term positive and negative started a little bit earlier, but everyone now understands the concept. I'll tell you what. If you started with low relief as a fault, normal fault, and this normal fault started during the tension regime, and then subjected to transpression or to compression, then it's inverted up. I mean, what was low become up. This is a positive. It could be vice versa. It could be something high and then it goes down. This is a negative inversion. So the positive inversion, it started low and ended with high. The vice versa one is called a positive negative inversion. So we are not dealing with any kind of negative inversion in our case. Most of the cases and most of the publication is dealing with positive inversion, which means that something was below the surface and then become above the surface. It's a positive inversion. While negative inversion, as example, imagine that you have a thrust fault that give you a very nice anticline and then undergone tension and they become low. This is a kind of negative inversion. So
okay.
for simplicity, use the term of positive inversion all the time.
Okay, Doctor. Another question, why the amplitude increases with offset in case of gas reservoirs?
Actually, this is another thing. Maybe what I have offered for the AVO is not enough in order to understand for G and G guys, but actually the behavior of the rock when you throw the stone will behave different than when you throw the liquid when you throw your stone. An example, if in case of you change the water when you have the stone, and then you throw the stone on the top of the water or with angle, it will go and hit the water and then jump and hit the water and then jump. Now, if you change the water with rubber, yes, rubber. Imagine that you change the water with rubber and you throw the stone, it will never do what it used to do when it was liquid. This is why, because the behavior of the rubber is elastic. It behaves like rocks. While the water is fluid, it behaves like fluid. When you put the fluid inside the rubber, so things are changing with the rubber. It have sort of mix. Rather than showing increase on the near offset, it's showing increase on the far offset. So what change? It's not the wave. The change is the media itself, the behavior of the elastic properties of the media. When the media is fluid, it behaves a certain behavior. When the media is rock, it behaves like elastic, like rubber. When you mix the fluid and put them inside the rock behaves different. And that's why it's increased by distance. By the way, within the AVO, there is what we call it classes. It's not only increasing. There is another class that it decreased by offset, and the gas is there. Then another class, it's increased and then it's decreased and then increase. So you have class 1, class 2, and class 3, and actually there is class 4, and there is class 5 now. So you have from class 1 to class 5 different behavior for the presence of the gas, but all of them under the impression of the change of the rock properties of the sand because of the presence of different type of fluids. Fluid include gas, or fluid includes water, or fluid includes salt water, or whatever the fluid is. Okay?
Okay, thanks, Doctor, for your great illustrations. It looks like we have covered most of the important questions. Dr. Ali, is there anything else you wanted to cover before I wrap up?
Actually, for me, no, thank you very much. And I wish that my colleague captured most of what we have said. And I know there is a lot of many things that I just flied over, but I kept in myself that 1 hour or 2 hour listening is enough. I always believe that short message is much, much better than longer time. Thank you very much again for you and for your colleague.
Okay, thanks, Doctor, and we appreciate that you have finished in the specified time. Thank you, Doctor. Thanks, everyone, and we hope to see you in our next lecture, inshallah. Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you. Thank you.